They looked like the definition of black love, a reformed hustler and a beautiful single mom building a new future. Their story seemed like something out of a fairy tale, a romance filled with second chances, sweet moments, and social media snapshots that captured the world's attention. But behind the filtered photos, behind the cute hashtags and the picture-perfect smiles, there was something darker, a ticking time bomb. Paranoia, jealousy, secrets, and ultimately, blood. How does a relationship go from a fairy tale proposal to a murder scene in just a matter of hours? What happens when love turns possessive and trust dies before the honeymoon even begins? Tonight, we're diving into the tragic story of Jacayla Hensley, Deshaun Riddick, and the deadly consequences of a love that couldn't survive the weight of its own secrets. Before we dive into this shocking case, make sure to like this video and subscribe for more disturbing true crime stories, where love and darkness collide. Jacayla Hensley was a 27-year-old dental assistant, a single mom living in Charlotte, North Carolina, doing her best to build a life that was both steady and full of hope. She was the type of woman who radiated warmth, with a soft voice and a laugh that could light up a room. Her son, who was just 6 years old, was her world, and every chance she got, she made sure to share their little moments of happiness on social media. Her Instagram was filled with photos of her son's toothy grin, Bible verses, and captions that spoke of healing, growth, and leaving behind the painful past. People admired Jacayla for how she carried herself, for the way she seemed to rise above the struggles she had faced. She was independent, strong, and a bit of a dreamer, always believing in second chances. Her friends often praised her for being kind and forgiving, even when life had shown her nothing but hard lessons. But those who were closest to her knew that behind her smiles, there was a woman who had endured more than her fair share of heartache. It was through this lens that Jacayla met Deshaun Riddick. He was 35, ruggedly handsome, with a magnetic presence that drew people to him. Deshaun had a past, a dark one. A former convict, he'd served 5 years for charges related to weapons possession and drug distribution. But when Jacayla met him, he claimed that he had turned his life around. He had opened a custom car rim shop and was adamant that his past was just that, past. His words were smooth, his charm undeniable. At first, Jacayla was cautious. She had been through enough to know that not everyone who came into her life had pure intentions. But Deshaun's persistence wore her down. He showered her with gifts, flowers at her job, surprise lunches, and even weekend trips to the lake, all designed to make her feel special. He quickly found his place in her life, bonding with her son in ways that made her heart swell. He coached the little boy's peewee football team and bought him brand new sneakers. It was everything Jacayla thought she had been waiting for. A man who understood her son. She called him her protector, her second chance at love. The proposal came just a year after they started dating. It was a rooftop dinner with her family and her son there to witness it. Tears welled up in Jacayla's eyes as Deshaun knelt in front of her, a shiny ring in his hand. The moment was perfect in its own way, the air full of romantic promise. Jacayla said yes, and in that moment, everything seemed to align. The world, especially their online followers, called them goals, the perfect couple, destined for greatness. But those closest to Jacayla weren't as convinced. They saw the cracks. They saw the jealous streaks in Deshaun's behavior, the intense need for control, the possessiveness that he masked with charm. They saw the way he would call her at all hours, the way he demanded to know where she was, who she was with. They didn't speak up, though. It was her happiness, her decision. So, they kept quiet, watching as the relationship unfolded, unaware that the real danger was already inside. It wasn't long before the cracks would begin to show themselves, too deep to ignore. Deshaun Riddick had demons that clung to him from the moment he could remember. He wasn't a man who liked to talk about his past, but it was there, buried under layers of charm and bravado. His mother had abandoned him when he was just a baby, leaving him to be raised by a bitter aunt who never showed him love or affection. His father. He saw him gunned down in front of him during a robbery when he was only 10 years old. That kind of violence, something so deeply imprinted in a child's mind, didn't fade. It followed him, shaped him, turned his worldview dark. It wasn't just the past that haunted him. It was the future too. Deshaun had never trusted love. Not completely. Not after everything he'd been through. It wasn't that he didn't want to be loved or that he didn't yearn for it, but there was always this shadow lurking in the back of his mind, a shadow that whispered, "You're not worthy of love. No one will stick around." That fear, that insecurity, twisted his need for control into something unhealthy. At first, Jakayla didn't see the signs. She wanted to believe in the man he was presenting to the world, the man who brought her flowers, who showered her son with affection, who whispered sweet promises of a life they could build together. But as the days went on, she began to notice the cracks. The first time he accused her of cheating was when she stayed late at work. He didn't even have proof, just an accusation that hit her like a slap in the face. At first, she brushed it off, telling herself that he was just dealing with past trauma, that his behavior was rooted in the wounds he carried from childhood. But the accusations didn't stop. They grew more frequent, more intense. If she didn't answer his calls fast enough, he'd blow up her phone, flooding it with messages and voicemails. He'd demand to know where she was, who she was with, what she was doing. And it wasn't just jealousy, it was obsession. She told herself he'd change. That he'd grow out of it. But deep down, she knew the truth. He couldn't change what had been ingrained in him for years. The fear of abandonment, of not being enough, had twisted into something darker, the need to control everything, especially her. But the worst of it came when Deshaun convinced himself, without a shred of evidence, that Jakayla was sleeping with his older brother, DeAndre. It wasn't a passing thought, a fleeting insecurity. No, in Deshaun's mind, it was a reality. He saw it everywhere, in every interaction, every glance. DeAndre was tall, confident, and effortlessly charming in a way that made people gravitate toward him. And somewhere in Deshaun's warped mind, that meant Jakayla must be drawn to him too. It didn't matter that DeAndre was married or that Jakayla had never given Deshaun any reason to think there was something between them. The idea was planted, and it festered, growing like an infection in his mind. That paranoia began to rot him from the inside out. It gnawed at him, controlling his every thought, his every action. Jakayla noticed how he would shut down whenever DeAndre was mentioned, how his eyes would narrow with suspicion whenever she spoke about him. She tried to dismiss it, telling herself it was just his fear talking. But the more Deshaun spun his web of lies, the more he pulled her into it. She tried to convince herself it was just trauma, that he'd never been shown real love, that she could help him heal. But Deshaun's need for control began to suffocate their relationship. To him, loving Jakayla wasn't just about companionship, it was about possession. She wasn't just his partner, she was his property. The idea of her walking away, especially not just from him but for someone he already had a personal vendetta against, was unbearable. When she said yes to marrying him, it wasn't just a moment of joy for Deshaun, it was a ticking time bomb. In his mind, she was his now. Forever. No one could take her from him. Not even her son, not even her friends, and certainly not DeAndre. He had locked her down, and he would make sure she would never leave. And if she ever tried, he would make sure she paid the price. It wasn't about love anymore, it was about control. It should have been the happiest night of Jakayla Hensley's life. A night of celebration, of promise, of forever. Deshaun had planned everything perfectly. He rented a suite in uptown Charlotte, a place with a view that could make anyone feel on top of the world. There was champagne, the kind she'd only ever seen in movies, and takeout from her favorite seafood spot, a little slice of luxury that made the night feel even more special. The night felt like a fairy tale, until it didn't. The surveillance cameras caught them as they walked into the building just after 1:30 a.m., their laughter echoing down the empty hallways. Jakayla was leaning into Deshaun, her head resting on his shoulder, her hand clasped in his. It was the picture of a couple in love, of a life just beginning, but that image was fragile. Beneath the laughter, beneath the kisses, there was a tension neither of them could see coming. Somewhere between the warmth of the champagne and the softness of the candles, the mood began to shift. The smiles faded, replaced by an unease that neither of them could escape. Investigators later concluded that the shift in atmosphere came from something so small, so insignificant on the surface, but devastating in the mind of a man already consumed by jealousy. Deshawn had seen it, the text on Jacayla's phone from DeAndre. It was harmless, a simple message that any brother would send to a sister. "Tell Lil Man I said good luck tomorrow." But to Deshawn, it wasn't just a message. It was a betrayal. In that one moment, with the shadows of doubt and paranoia clouding his mind, that innocent text became proof of something he couldn't ignore. To him, it meant something more than words. It meant she was hiding something from him, something that confirmed his worst fear. The argument began almost immediately. Jacayla, still caught up in the joy of the night, tried to brush it off. She told him she loved him, that she had said yes to being with him, to building a life together. She reassured him over and over again, tried to calm him down, but the words didn't reach him. It was as if everything she said was swallowed by the storm inside him. He wasn't hearing her. His mind was locked in a place where logic couldn't exist, where everything he feared was true. The paranoia had already taken root, and there was no going back. Fueled by liquor, the venomous jealousy of what he thought he had seen, and the deep well of insecurities he could never escape, Deshawn snapped. The man who had wooed her, who had promised to love her and protect her, became someone unrecognizable. His anger spiraled out of control, a hurricane in a small hotel room. Jacayla, still trying to make sense of it, couldn't understand how things had turned so violently. Her heart raced, not from excitement, but from fear, as she tried to find a way to bring him back to the man she thought she knew. But there was no bringing him back. Not tonight. The night that should have marked the beginning of a new chapter in Jacayla Hensley's life became the end of it. The noise came first. Neighbors reported hearing 2 gunshots followed by a blood-curdling scream, then a third shot that echoed into the night. It was a sound that shattered the peace of the upscale Charlotte neighborhood, and within moments, the sirens of responding officers filled the air. When police arrived at the suite, the scene was both horrific and surreal. Jacayla's lifeless body was found slumped by the staircase. She had been shot at point-blank range, the violence reflected in the devastation of her injuries, 2 gunshots, one to her chest and the other to her face. Her phone, still gripped tightly in her hand, was a haunting reminder of the life she had just been living, the messages and pictures that would never be answered, the love that had once felt so real now reduced to a frozen, tragic moment. Upstairs in the bedroom, Deshawn sat alone. The room was still, the air thick with the residue of his rage. He was on the bed, the gun resting on his lap, muttering to himself in a trance-like state. "She was gonna leave me. I saw it." His words, barely audible, were filled with the delusion that had consumed him. The truth didn't matter anymore, only his paranoia and twisted beliefs had taken hold. He wasn't a man in love, but a man lost in his own madness. Jacayla's attempt to leave, to be free, had broken him in ways he couldn't understand, and now, in the wake of his violent outburst, he was left to face the reality of what he had done. Jacayla's son had spent the night at his aunt's house, blissfully unaware of the terror that had unfolded. He would never again hear his mother's laugh, never feel the comfort of her arms around him. The blood had yet to dry on the floor when the police arrived, and the ring Jacayla had worn so proudly, just hours before, was still on her finger, symbolizing a promise that had never been kept. What was meant to be a wedding became a funeral, and the carefully planned details of a future together unraveled into a nightmare. The life that Jacayla had dreamed of, a life with love, a life with Deshawn, was gone, replaced by the horror of a senseless act of violence. In the aftermath, the reality of the tragedy set in. Jacayla's friends and family were left to process the fact that she was gone. The news would spread, and the community, once proud of her success and happiness, was left to grapple with the disturbing truth of her murder. A woman's life had been violently stolen, not by a stranger, but by the man she had trusted the most. And in the end, Deschamps' obsessive need to control, his delusions of betrayal, had led him to a place from which there was no return. The love that once filled the air had turned to ashes, and Jacqueline, forever frozen in time, would never get the chance to see the life she had dreamed of. The media storm that followed Jacqueline Hensley's murder was swift, unforgiving, and all-encompassing. News stations and social media outlets lit up with the horrific details of the crime. Headlines screamed, "From yes to death, Charlotte man kills fiancée hours after proposal," and the public couldn't look away. It was a tale that blurred the lines between love and violence, obsession and affection. Deschamps, once seen as a reformed man, someone who had turned his life around, was now portrayed as a tragic example of how unchecked emotional turmoil could spiral into deadly violence. As investigators combed through the evidence, they uncovered more than just a brutal crime. Police recovered Jacqueline's private journal, a window into the mind of a woman who had been desperately trying to make sense of her crumbling relationship. In the pages, Jacqueline wrote, "He watches me sleep. I feel like I'm disappearing." It was a chilling insight into the suffocating grip Deschamps had on her. The recordings found on her phone painted a similarly grim picture, with heated arguments captured where Deschamps accused Jacqueline of playing games and lying like all the others. These were not the words of a man who was in love, they were the words of a man consumed by insecurity, jealousy, and a fear of abandonment. The public's reaction was immediate and polarizing. As the case gained national attention, it sparked a heated debate about domestic violence, toxic masculinity, and the patterns of behavior that often go unnoticed until it's too late. The nation watched, horrified, as a young woman's dream was snuffed out by a relationship gone violently wrong, and the questions lingered: how many more women suffer in silence before they disappear altogether? How many times do we let love turn into a trap before we recognize the signs? Deschamps Riddick's trial was a spectacle that captivated the public, drawing attention not just for the brutality of the crime, but for the defense that would try to explain it. His lawyer argued that Deschamps was not fully responsible for his actions, pleading not guilty by reason of insanity. The defense painted a picture of a man scarred by abandonment trauma, a product of his past filled with loss and instability. They claimed that Deschamps had untreated bipolar disorder, a mental health condition that, they argued, contributed to his violent outburst. The courtroom buzzed with tension as the jury listened intently to this narrative, trying to reconcile the man Deschamps once appeared to be, a charming, reformed figure, with the brutal reality of what he had done. But the prosecution countered with a mountain of evidence that painted a different picture, one that could not be ignored. Text messages from Deschamps to Jacqueline, filled with accusations and threats, were read aloud in court. Recordings from her phone, where he raged with jealousy and control, reverberated throughout the room. And most damning of all, the physical evidence of bruises from past fights, marks of a history of abuse. The jury was left with little doubt. The defense's arguments fell flat in the face of the overwhelming proof that Deschamps' violence was not a result of a mental breakdown, but rather a pattern of possessiveness and control that had escalated to murder. After just 4 hours of deliberation, the jury reached a verdict: guilty of first-degree murder. The decision was swift and final. Deschamps was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, his future sealed by the choices he had made in a moment of rage. As the courtroom emptied, the real aftermath of the trial began to unfold. Jacqueline's son, now 7 years old, was left to grow up without the woman who had once been his world. Raised by his aunt in Raleigh, he still asked questions that no child should ever have to ask: why didn't mommy come back from that fancy hotel? The innocent curiosity in his voice broke the hearts of everyone who knew the story, a painful reminder of the family that had been shattered. Jacqueline's loss would never be fully understood by a child too young to comprehend the complexities of adult relationships. But he would grow up carrying the weight of her absence, a scar that no verdict could erase. The justice that had been served in the courtroom would never bring his mother back. And in the quiet of his grief, there would always be the question of why love had turned so dark. This case serves as a chilling reminder that sometimes, the most beautiful love stories mask the ugliest truths. Jacqueline believed in redemption. She saw potential in Deshawn, a man she thought could overcome his past. But redemption, when it's not paired with accountability, is merely a ticking clock. In the end, silence didn't protect her, loyalty cost her everything. She gave her heart to someone who, despite his promises, never learned how to love without control, and it ultimately became her undoing. What warning signs should never be ignored in a relationship? The subtle shifts in behavior, the increasing accusations, the possessiveness masked as concern. Could Jacqueline have been saved if she walked away sooner? Or was she already trapped in a cage called love, where leaving would have meant sacrificing the future she dreamed of? These are questions that remain, unanswered and haunting. Jacqueline's story is a tragedy of misplaced faith, of a woman whose hope in love became a deadly lie. If this story broke your heart and opened your eyes, like and subscribe for more real stories that expose the darkest truths behind the prettiest pictures.